When my guest this week, Etienne de Villiers, agreed to come on the podcast, I knew we'd be chatting about two wonderful worlds, the wonderful world of entertainment and that of sport. And Etienne definitely didn't disappoint. He grew up in a South Africa blighted by apartheid and where TV didn't exist, and at a time when the country was increasingly shunned by the international community. But he used his talents to become CEO of South African conglomerate Satbel and pushed owner Sol Kerzner and Interior Minister de Klerk to open up the group cinemas to all races. He then built the Disney International TV business from $15 million a year to $1 billion before taking on senior roles in sport, including the ATP and advising the IPL when it briefly moved to South Africa. We talked about those early days in South Africa, the business lessons of Jeffrey Katzenberg, the challenges of building up the profile of tennis internationally, and how and why the growth of the IPO in India is so hard to replicate. Enjoy. Hi Etienne, welcome to the pod.
Morning, Danny. Thank you so much for having me on. I feel cowed by the esteem and authority that your other guests have, and I feel I'm an imposter.
No, not at all, not at all. But let's see how we get on, and hopefully we can demonstrate that's not the case. I always like to start with a fun question, but we've got so much ground to cover that I'm going to incorporate it and combine it with other questions. But I'd like to start with your early life. And growing up in South Africa, sport clearly played a big part in that early life. Previous South African guests have said that TV was pretty restricted in those days. And so a couple of questions, really. One, if sport was very big, how big was film and TV in those early days? And then secondly, if you had the chance to represent South Africa professionally at any one sport, which one would you have chosen at the time?
Two questions there, right? First one, television played no part of my youth. I was 25 before television was introduced to South Africa. So we grew up with radio. South Africa has a very strong storytelling tradition, like the Irish. And most of the stories we heard were either around a dinner table or listening to radio. Film was always a major influence, certainly in my life, because of the absence of TV. The film industry flourished. South Africa was at one stage the sixth or the seventh biggest market for film product in the world when the rand was stronger, and because it had this wonderful infrastructure of cinemas and theaters. And because of the storytelling ethic, we were all intrigued. I was certainly intrigued with film. So I used to devour film. To answer your second question, I guess I would never say I was a contender to becoming a Springbok. I didn't have this discipline and I didn't have the self-esteem I think that you need to have. I didn't have the confidence in my own abilities. I showed glimmers of it when I was 18 and 19. I would have loved to have played for the Springboks, despite the uncomfortable connotation of the Springbok and its relationship to the Afrikaner and apartheid.
You came to the UK as a Rhodes Scholar to study at Oxford. Was that an incredibly liberating and fascinating experience?
The one thing I did dream about and always wanted to do was to go to Oxford. There was something ethereal and something hard to quantify as to why I wanted to go there, but I did. And going there as a Rhodes Scholar was something I dreamt of, but never thought I could achieve. So yes, liberating, scary. I think scary because I always regarded myself as very liberally minded. But when I got to Oxford, I realized just how tainted and tarnished one's sense of pure liberalism becomes when you're subjected to an environment that feeds you consciously and unconsciously these biases. And what I learned very early on was that trying to explain South Africa and explain apartheid along the grounds of relative moralism was just not a path that was in any way productive. So that was the first thing I learned. The second thing I learned was when you were asked about apartheid, and you just, the only answer you could give, and the only appropriate answer, it is heinous, wrong, abhorrent, and it should change. So let's move on and talk about something else.
You studied and started your career in engineering before moving into consultancy at McKinsey. So how did you then make the move into the entertainment world of Satbel and Sol Kerzner?
I was doing work for one of my great mentors, Ronnie Lubner in South Africa, who was friendly with a number of very influential people, one of whom I played tennis with. And he said to me, I think you're wasted with Ronnie doing what you're doing. I want you to meet Sol. And I said, Sol who? And he said, Sol Kerzner. And I went, okay. He was a client, but a fearsome man with an enormous reputation of being this very bold entrepreneur. I was invited to lunch, and they started talking about this conglomerate that he'd bought the control of called Satbel. I'd read briefly about that, but had done no homework. And at the end of the lunch, Kerzner looked at me and said, I'd looked at Charles Fidian Green, who was the guy the mutual friend. He said to Charles, what do you think? And Charles said, well, he looks pretty good in the nets. I would give him a chance to get out there and bat in the middle. For you American friends, that's cricket analogy. And he looked at me and he said, Sol will give you this job. Don't fuck it up. I went, okay, fine. And that was it. It was an hour-long lunch. And I was offered this opportunity to run a massive conglomerate. It was 16 different companies. I think it was 6,000 people or more. The largest portion of which was cinema, both the production and 70% of all of the cinemas in South Africa. How can I put it? I was really scared. I thought to myself, if ever the imposter syndrome is going to reveal itself, it's right now, because I have got to run this conglomerate.
And how did you go about running this massive business, especially when you have a larger-than-life character like Sol Kerzner as a boss?
With a lot of fear and a lot of difficulty. On the one hand, enormous excitement had been generated by Sol's involvement in the movie and entertainment business, and the media expected the same kind of razzle dazzle and excitement that they were getting out of Sun City with these musicians that were arriving from all over the world, and all of the innovations that Sol was making. At the same time, I was firing hundreds of people, many of whom sat in offices just below my office in the main building in Johannesburg. And I must have come across as this truly arrogant, smug Aravist who had no working knowledge of the business, and yet was making all of these wonderful pronouncements. So my CFO said, I think you should go and introduce yourself and do a little bit of stop and chat. And so I did, and we walked through the whole building. Took us a couple of hours, and hopefully people got to understand who I was, and not who they thought I was from television or from interviews on radio. But we got to the bottom of this big building and went into a basement, and I just saw literally dozens of musicians standing outside what looked like a small office. That's Ovation Sound Studio, said my CFO. I said, oh, is that part of us? And she said, yeah, that's a small division that we have, catered mostly to the black music market. And I said, oh, interesting. It's really busy. He said, I've never seen it like this. And a very beleaguered head engineer came out, and I'd met him through my brother, who was a musician. And he said, I can't see you today, Etienne. It's got to be some other time. I said, oh, I'm down here now. He said, I can't. We've got somebody here who shouldn't be here, and I'm sorry, I just can't. So that, of course, piqued my curiosity. And I said, oh, then I'm coming in. Walked into the sound studio, and sitting at the mixing desk was Paul Simon and Ray Haley. And they were just starting to audition musicians for what was one of the truly great albums of all time, Graceland. And I just said to my CFO, well, I'll see you in a couple of hours. I'm staying here. And I sat down at the desk with them. And honestly, three of us that were in the sound studio with Paul Simon and Ray and myself were on our knees listening to the musicianship and the talent that was displayed over the next couple of hours. And many of these musicians didn't know how to read music. And Paul said to Ray, they can't even, Ray said to Paul, they can't even read music. And he said, who cares? Just listen to them play, man. This is incredible. So I was gifted 2 hours of my life that I will forever remember. It was such a privilege and such an honor and such a blessing to be in the company of one of the truly great singer-songwriters of our time, and a truly, truly wonderful man, very thoughtful, very empathetic, very sensitive, very smart. And he shone a light on African musical talent that was very, very controversial, because as a result of what Sol was doing with Frank Sinatra and Liza Minnelli and Queen and Elton John, Rod Stewart coming to play at Sun City, provoked this incredible reaction by the music industry, and which ended up in a boycott. And Paul was caught in this with this dilemma, wanting to shine a light on this talent that existed and give them more of an exposure to the world. At the same time, being vilified by his colleagues and his industry for breaking a boycott. But what a gift I received.
And you ended up working with the then Minister of Internal Affairs and later President and Nobel Prize winner, FW de Klerk, to desegregate South Africa's cinemas. When leaders are agents of change in business, they're usually only focused on profitability and wealth creation. But that seems to me to have had another political stroke moral dimension, as well as a profitability side of it. And I think that's a really interesting experience that most people listening to this podcast won't have been through.
My relationship with South Africa was bewildering pre and post my 3-4 years at Oxford. Initially, I was deeply resentful of not only the government and the policy of apartheid, but I became deeply resentful towards even friends and family who accepted the system. And I was very angrily trying to, or wanting to, express my displeasure and wanting to do something about it. That anger diluted somewhat by the time I joined Satbel. But I think there was a latent ambition to wanting to make a difference in a way that was meaningful, or at least represented to me an attempt to do something. And the old adage, if you can't fix something, feature it, was what I applied to the rationale that I expressed to Sol, saying, we have a problem with a number of our cinemas in the central business district. White South Africans typically live in the suburbs, do not go into the central business district on the weekends or after dark. We have all of these great cinema complexes. Why don't we apply to make them desegregated? And I knew that if once you'd opened that door, you could open all of the doors. And Sol wasn't convinced. He thought it was a bad idea, thought I was going to spend a lot of time wasted, and wasn't necessarily the best use of my time or the most profitable way of utilizing the cinemas. But Martin Scorsese's film, Kundun, was the first film, and probably the only film, that was withdrawn from exhibition in South Africa based on Scorsese's repugnance towards apartheid. And I used that example with FW de Klerk as a potential forerunner for the entire industry. If this happens once, it's going to happen a lot. And if that happens a lot, we're going to be starved of legitimate entertainment. And once that happens, you have, Minister de Klerk, you have a situation that you can no longer control, because piracy will be rife, not only bad for the entertainment industry, but very bad for controlling the message that you clearly want to control within the country. And he listened very, very carefully, went away, and the wheels started turning, much to my surprise, because there was a huge amount of legislation that was needed to change, certainly in the central business districts, of allowing Black people to come in and out of the area, and certainly being able to travel after dark and stuff. Just horrendous if you think about it. Just horrendous. But many years later, I saw FW at a social function, and we were introduced by a mutual friend. And I said to him, I don't know whether you remember, but I came to see you many, many years ago. And he said, oh, I remember very clearly. I said, well, you do know that I was bluffing. And he said, of course I knew you were bluffing, but I needed to bluff my people, because unless we didn't have a credible bluff, no one was going to change things, which is how it turned out for a while, because P.W. Botha, the then Prime Minister, decided a few months later, after I'd been made an offer to go and join the Walt Disney Company, made an announcement, the famous Rubicon speech, that South Africa was not for changing its course. And that led to a plunge in the Rand's value, which pushed me to go and visit Jeffrey Katzenberg and ask him whether the offer was still open.
And how did you find the transition to US and specifically Hollywood corporate culture?
That's a great question. I think it's too simplistic to describe them as that. There was a Disney culture which was very much the culture in the studio of the Paramount, Charlie Bluethorn, Barry Diller culture, which I think was unkindly known. His acolytes were unkindly known as Diller's killers. And it was a very, very confrontational, combative culture that I was exposed to when Jeffrey and Michael and Frank Wells, who was from Warner Brothers, but kind of bought into that culture, it was very much zero sum. It was very much, what have you done for me today? Not sure that was the culture of a Warner's or a culture of Sony, but certainly it was the culture of Disney. I was blessed fortuitously by being allowed to build my own organization in London. And the reason for doing that, Michael wanted, as president of television, wanted all of his direct reports and Michael's and Jeffrey's direct reports in Burbank. I was contracted to do that. I knew that was going to be very, very difficult, not just for my family, but it was going to be very difficult to build an international business based geographically so far removed from your major markets, just in terms of logistics, just in terms of being able to speak to people with an 8-hour time difference. Fortunately, the company decided very early on in the piece that we were going to build a theme park in Paris. Michael charged me with a requirement to have 3 hours of Disney branded programming in a major network in a major market in Europe. So, I said, fine, I'll do that with pleasure, but I can't do it from Los Angeles. I've got to be in the market. I've got to be in Europe. And he allowed me to build the organization, which now finds itself in Hammersmith on the roundabout. All of those massive buildings belong to Disney.
How do you successfully manage a business of that size?
I think the important thing from my perspective was I was able to build my own culture with my own organization that reflected my values. As long as you're effective, you were allowed to get on with it, which is what happened for the first 8 to 10 years at Disney. The growth was stellar. Nobody in Burbank truly understood what we were doing. The whole world of television was quite arcane, the whole distribution side of it. In 96, when Jeffrey went to form DreamWorks, Frank had died. Very, very cathartic time. I was given the Disney channels internationally, as well as production, as well as broadcasting, as well as pay television. So my world of influence expanded geometrically at that point. And that's when I had my first real challenge to how I did things. And at that point, realized that I had to delegate more and bring more people on board. And I also learned very, very early on in life that you only delegated things that you understood. You never delegated things that you didn't. You had to spend time with the things that you felt least comfortable with. Wonderfully challenging times. And we did pretty good. We got 5 or 6 of the Disney channels up and running by the time I left. We did 16 or 18 joint ventures, HBO, joint ventures around the world, stuff in Germany, joint ventures in India, just very, very interesting stuff. And so we gradually built a really great team. We all stuck together through between 8 and 12 years of growth and expansion, and far less reliant on process. I think my staff realized quite quickly that I was very effective or efficient in turning paper around. I had a philosophy that I would only ever touch a piece of paper once. This is pre-email times and pre-digital era. And so you were dealing with lots of faxes, and you were dealing with handwritten notes on faxes, and which you would scroll back and then fax back to the author. But I had piles of paper, and I had a view that you were only allowed to touch that piece of paper once. So it either went into the bin, or it went to somewhere else, or it went to my secretary for my assistant for actioning. And my staff were impressed with that. But what they also realized was that I didn't have a great system for following up. So I'd get them to do things, and there would be a flurry of activity, and then I wouldn't have a system to figure out what I'd asked had been done or not. So I eventually got them, when we started moving into emails, I got them to do a weekly report. Each of my direct reports would do a weekly report. And I said, it's a really quite simple thing. You have to tell me what you've been doing this week, and what you're going to do, what you're doing next week, and what your follow-ups to the various questions that I had from the previous week were. And here's the catch: if you don't produce a report by the Friday, you'll be fined $1,000, and we'll pool all of that money, and we'll have a nice big party, but you will be fined $1,000. And it's amazing how well-paid executives took that pretty seriously. I also had a rule that in a big open office at Disney, where we had maybe 60 or 70 people sitting and maybe 7 or 8 personal assistants, that if a phone rang and it wasn't answered and it went to voicemail, that they would all be fined. All of the PAs would be fined £10. I just felt it was wrong for a consumer-facing business to resort to voicemail. And that worked. It was very effective. So effective that my HR department came back and said, we can't hire PAs anymore because they're terrified of your draconian £10 fine. So some of my processes worked, some of mine didn't. Ultimately, you look for the right skills, you look for the right staff, and the style of your organization, the culture of organization is critical.
And on the TV side of things, you had a very strong team, many of whom have gone on to hold very senior positions in the TV industry. Were there any specific skills or characteristics that you looked for when it came to putting that group together?
You had to be smart, as Jeffrey Katzenberg said to me when I asked him why Disney was going to be one of the biggest studios in Hollywood. He said, everyone in this industry is smart. You can't be smarter than the next, but you can work harder, and we will work harder than anyone else. So that was one of the key things I learned from Jeffrey. The other key thing I learned from Jeffrey was make new mistakes. You can't build a creative industry without being prepared to risk failing but learning from those mistakes and making new ones. So I looked for people that were smart, and it was very easy to attract smart people because it was Disney, and the industry was a magnet for anyone that wanted to have an enjoyable and a challenging career. But what I was looking for as well was people who were prepared to talk back to the boss, people who would look hard at their own opinions and the opinions of others. And I encourage a collaborative form of challenging accepted wisdom, if you want.
I guess the Disney brand was central to everything you do. And that, I suppose, is something that has differentiated Disney from other studios.
What was interesting was we often used to ask ourselves, what does Disney actually mean? And it was only when we had a 2-day retreat where we really challenged ourselves, well, will we allow, and this is when we were doing the channels rather than our own clubs or the Disney hours, what is Disney and what isn't Disney? Is a story about a family with a preteen girl rather, who's experiencing menstruation for the first time, is that appropriate for Disney or not? And we had these really, really fiery debates about what goes into the Disney Channel and what doesn't, because you had to acquire a lot of programming to supplement what was a reasonably thin Disney catalog of programming. And so we eventually came out with a little 4-letter acronym, which I've used in tennis as well and in Formula One. And the acronym was DIAL, DIAL. And for something to go into the Disney Channel, the D needed to be what goes on inside the Disney company. So the D was for Disney, and somebody who came to the Disney Channel would be given a proprietary look at what goes on behind the scenes, what goes into making a Disney program, etc. So it was a behind the scenes look at Disney. The I was about imagination. If anything that Disney did well, it was done with the imagination that you never quite anticipated. Rastafarian crab singing under the sea, the opening sequence to The Lion King. The imagination was just bafflingly wonderful, in fact. The A was about aspiration. All great Disney stories were aspirational. They were about fulfilling dreams. It was about reaching something that you always wanted. That was an essence of a Disney story. And the L was about recognizing milestones in one's life. So there was life's milestones, celebrating coming of age, celebrating those milestones in your life that we all encounter. So that helped us think about what programming made Disney, and it was incredibly informative, because too often the lazy way out was it's wholesome, it's family, it's friendly, it's nothing you can create against. Whereas Dial gave everyone an idea of what you were looking to do when you created stories, what you were looking to do when you bought stories, what you were looking to do with all of the interstitials, the marketing, the advertising. It was all based around Dial.
So you touched on some of the other sports that you were involved in, and tennis was one of those. What was the ATP experience, and how did that differ from the kind of commercial operation that you'd experienced in the past, such as Walt Disney Company, for example?
If I was to think about it clearly, the difference was down to common vision or clarity of purpose that existed at Disney and didn't exist within tennis, and the ability to change or get things done, which a well-structured organization with a very clear mission, a very clear vision and economic requirements imposes. That didn't exist within tennis. I took over from an individual who'd run the ATP for 13 years, a man I admire very much, and I admired even more when I realized just how intractably difficult the job was. To give you perspective, in 15 years before I joined, sort of in the 1990s, tennis and golf were pretty much at the same level of prize money, around $60 to $70 million of prize money, excluding the Grand Slams, the 4 big tennis tournaments which the ATP did not control. By the time I was appointed in 2005, tennis revenues were still at the same level. Golf, as a result of Tiger Woods' prize money, had gone to $200 million. So tennis was lagging very, very dramatically. The biggest problem was that when we did independent research, because that was one of the first things that I did, was commission research, and had always been the basis of understanding potential and understanding markets at Disney. To me, it was an obvious thing to do. What the research revealed was quite dramatic. It revealed that very, very few people who professed to have an interest in tennis, and we made sure that we sampled the right types of people with the right basic criteria for inclusion. What they said is they were confused by what was going on in tennis. They had no idea whether the Queen's tournament, for example, that was the big grass tournament before Wimbledon, whether that was an exhibition match, whether that was a part of a tour or what. They had no idea how players got ranked. They had no idea of the structure of the calendar. Where does tennis go? We don't know. We don't care. I remember being quoted in one of the journals that if Wimbledon men's finals in the US attracts a lower rating on television than a hot dog eating competition, which was at the same time, then you know your sport's in trouble. And that was the real challenge. It was to get the sport to promote itself better, to structure it better so that people understood it and cared. And rather than to highlight each individual competition or tournament, which is what was being done in order to attract sponsorship or the naming rights, to start positioning it as an international tour, the way that the NFL is seen as a tour or the NBA is seen as a coherent entity. That just didn't exist. So it was a jumbled mess when I got there. And I think we left it in a much, much better place. We got over $1 billion of investment into the sport. We doubled the prize money. I was determined not to use the players in tennis as a sword with the Grand Slams, i.e. we would never threaten to boycott the Grand Slams, that I did say that we would use them as a shield, and that they had to reflect their double ranking point status by increasing the prize money, which they've done quite dramatically. So the sport has done, I'm not taking any credit for this. I had, again, a great team. It was very, very difficult to get things done. I would have got nothing done were it not for a wonderful friend of mine now who was Andre Agassi's manager and best friend, Perry Rogers. Perry told me he was going to back me because he believed in what we were doing. He got the other two player representatives to agree with him, wonderful individuals themselves. And I had two very supportive tournament directors, because without supermajority, two of each side, we couldn't get major things done. So there was a very intractable structure within the governance of the ATP, which made decision-making very difficult. I was blessed with collaborative, like-minded individuals who had a vision I had a vision, and they shared that vision with me.
And another sport that you were involved in and also, I guess, have a passion for is cricket. And the IPL in India is often held up as a case study for other sports and other leagues and competitions within the cricket world. People talking about doing the IPL of this or the IPL of that. But is that league actually an outlier that's almost impossible to emulate given the size and passion of the fan base in India?
You've phrased that question very well. I knew Lalit Modi from a very, very early stage. When he was in his 20s, he came to the Disney offices with his father, and we set up a joint venture to market film and television in India. And over the years, we grew more and more frustrated by the enormous power that Bollywood had, but even more power that the BCCI, the Indian Cricket Authority, has, and its influence on exposure to television. So in Lalit's mind, in order to have something that was kind of blockbuster TV appeal, he needed to combine Bollywood with cricket, with entertainment. And he arrived at this genius idea, which took many years to build out and to crystallize. But he did it from inside the BCCI. He had to find a way to get within the BCCI, which he did by buying control of many, many small cricket authorities or cricket clubs in Rajasthan, and through that became the Rajasthan representative of the BCCI, and then sold the idea of the IPL into the BCCI. And that's the critical piece, because if you don't have the blessing of the central authority, in this case the BCCI, you weren't going to go anywhere. It was going to be a threat to the traditional revenue streams of the BCCI, which was Test cricket fundamentally. There was nothing else. But the second bit was as important, was because of the importance of India within the cricket infrastructure. If India blessed something, it would happen. If India did not, nothing would happen, because so many of the countries, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, do not have the resources to create their own. So everyone is reliant on the revenues that a test match between India and their country generates. So what the BCCI were able to do is to carve out a however many 45 or slightly longer window now that it's bigger, within the calendar of cricket. And everyone who played Test cricket or who played international cricket were asked to recognize that that was a period where only the IPL would take place. So you have this massive pent-up demand for more cricket within India, 1.6 billion people who feel so very, very strongly about the sport, not satisfied by any real county cricket or local cricket within exposure within India. Along comes a product that is backed by many of the great Bollywood celebrities and had this real pizzazz and flourish that Lalit, aka P.T. Barnum, brought to this whole thing. So it really, really worked. I was quite staggered by how successful it was. And when he asked me to help him do it in South Africa, and I got to work day to day with this thing with the most impossible deadlines that were imposed upon us in moving it to South Africa, I just saw what a magical product it really was. But it was because all of the great cricketers in the world were paid a lot of money to play in something which the system, the product could afford for all of the reasons we just gone into. So to replicate all of those pieces is a very, very tricky thing to do. England was always going to be a feasible option because of the wealth of cricket and the wealth of the country and the relative importance of cricket within the British landscape. But even that is proving difficult for weather reasons, for structural reasons, and for calendar reasons. They've got to carve out a big chunk of time to do an IPL or a 100 or whatever it is.
I have very wonderful memories of traveling around South Africa and going on safari, often thanks to my good friends at Mnet who did a safari every year. And part of that involved getting on these little planes to go to these very interesting and amazing places. And I'm not a big flyer and I get travel sickness. And so it did occur to me that there might be an occasion where one of those little planes might not work or run out of fuel and you might get stuck somewhere. And I thought, well, that's a good place to think about what you would want to have with you to keep you company. So if you were down in South Africa and you found yourself stranded in the bush because your plane needed refueling and you were stuck there for a while, what would you want to have with you as your film, your TV box set, your book, and I think we'll go with sporting memory, maybe on disc or something, as something to get you through the wait until everything got fixed?
Well, you've used a wonderfully emotive hypothetical because the one thing we've done every year for the last 25 years is to, apart from the 2 years of COVID, was to go to our favorite place in the bush called Londolozi and spend increasingly more time doing what you need to do there, which is to examine your soul and examine who you really are when you're out in the bush. So a cruel answer to your question would be, I wouldn't need anything. I would just simply be there and experience the most rewarding, soul-enriching nirvana that anyone could ever be exposed to. But hypothetically, if I was to go somewhere where I needed electronic stimulation, it wouldn't be the best film I've ever seen because there are many that most people would argue that it would be Godfather or some rather well-known film. Cinema Paradiso, in my case as well, would be up there. But the film that I would take would be one that had built-in memories of experiences that I had. And the two that would qualify for that would both involve Robin Williams. One would be Good Morning Vietnam, where I was incredibly fortunate to be asked by Jeffrey to sit next to Robin at the Governor's Ball because he was nominated for Best Supporting. Didn't get it, but that was an extraordinary experience, one that I will never forget. But I think the one I would choose would be his other film that he made for us, which is Dead Poets Society, because so much of what I am today was as a result of the great teachers I had. And I had an equivalent of John Keating, the central character that Robin plays in the film, in South Africa, who stimulated all sorts of curiosity in my mind and an interest in the arts and an interest in a better life, really. So that would be my film. My book probably would be, again, something that talks more to the formative times in my life when I was a young and confused adult or pre-adult, growing up in apartheid. And that would probably be one of John Steinbeck's books of Mice and Men, probably. Best TV series, oh boy. Anything that Aaron Sorkin has written would be up there. West Wing, Newsroom, some of the great pieces of literature, really, that have been brought to film. Great stories told. Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, Sopranos, any one of them. In fact, well, I'm going to turn this on to you and say, of all of those, which one would you pick for me? Because I would be happy. I'll tell you which one I'm going to pick, just simply because it is so, to me, was the most enchanting, wonderfully heartwarming piece of television scripted by Mackenzie Crook called The Detectorists, with Toby Jones. And just because of its incredible humanity that is expressed throughout the 5 series or whatever it is. But of the big ones, I'm going to allow you to choose the one for me, and I will definitely watch it.
Okay, well, the producer of The Detectorists is one of the podcast listeners and has been a guest on the podcast, Adam Tandy. So that's great as a connective, some connective tissue to this question. Breaking Bad, I have a lot of love for, both personally and professionally, because I was involved in distributing that. But I would say The West Wing is the one to go with because it's just mesmeric. Writing, directing, all the quality, all the elements came together. The cast, I mean, it really is perfection as far as I'm concerned. So I would pick that one for you.
Well, there was the one other one.
There's one more. You can choose your category. There's album or music choice, or you could choose a favorite sporting moment as well.
Well, it's no question the favorite sporting moment was in October of 1995 when we won our very first, when South Africa won its very first World Cup. I'd been in South Africa with my father for the semifinals and flew back to England, and I invited all of our media friends to come to the cinema at Disney for the Saturday afternoon showing of the World Cup. And we were rank outsiders. We were going to get killed by a very strong All Blacks team, New Zealand team. But I can remember that when we won in extra time, I was sobbing. My wife was sobbing. Every South African that was in that cinema was sobbing. Friends like Greg Dyke and others came and just hugged us and just said, "We're so happy for you." The only person, just because he was being deliberately strident and difficult, was Dave Allen, the comic, who was a great friend of ours, and he just decided everyone else in your cinema is supporting South Africa, so I'm going to support New Zealand. I was very fortunate to know the captain Francois and Pina, and the coach of the Springboks was a friend and was my previous coach when I played at Harlequins. And I invited them to come to the cinema before they played England a few months later as world champions. And I put on a film for them. Kitch asked me to speak to them. And I said, you guys have to understand, and I'm getting quite emotional just telling the story. You guys have to understand how important that day was for us, because that's the first time in the time that I've spent here in the UK that I was accepted as a South African, that I felt proud to be a South African. When Nelson Mandela wore Francois Pienaar's jersey and handed that trophy to Francois, and Francois was asked, how important was it to have 60,000 people supporting you at Ellis Park? He said, you're wrong. We didn't have 60,000 people supporting us. We had 60 million people or 40 million people supporting us, because that was the first time that South Africa as a nation had come together, and had the pride of achievement that we all felt. So when I told the players this, you could actually see tears in their eyes. They realized that they had made a significant difference to how a country would heal. And had Mandela been a younger man, and had he lived longer, the country would have continued to heal. Unfortunately, it's not been the case.
Well, Etienne de Villiers, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. It's been amazing. You started our chat kind of questioning your place in some ways on being on the podcast, but I think you've demonstrated very clearly that you've been a fantastic guest, and this one will sit alongside all of the others with a lot of pride. So thank you very much for being on the show.
Danny, thank you for having me, and thank you for your kind words. I have to compliment you, though. You are a consummate host. You allow people to express themselves in a way that is not in any way confrontational or in any way uncomfortable. And you frame your questions so expertly that you make it easier for us to give smart answers. So thank you for doing this.
Absolute pleasure. It's only taken me 54 years to work out how to do that.